Hi, Misha here, and last time we talked about the modern T-90 and T-90A, and okay, let's tackle the most produced tank in human history so far, at least, hopefully ever, with somewhere between 90 and 100,000 built, the T-54, T-55 series. Two designs so closely related they're the same tank. And I alluded to these when we talked about the T-44. That was a while back, though. But it really is an outgrowth of World War II design, and really was one of the major pioneers in the medium tank turning into the main battle tank. So I've got a total of 5 models, 172 scale diecast, from quite a range of manufacturers, anywhere from cheaper ones like Americum and the February Eagle Moss, all the way up to Hobbymaster. So we'll use these to talk a bit about this tank's very long history. It's still in service today with between 30 and 50 nations, depending on how you classify it. And again, it served tens and thousands in Russia and elsewhere, and has been updated and modernized continuously, really since its advent. Let's go on and put the T-44 on the spinny thing briefly, and compare it with the oldest T-54 model I have here, at least in terms of configuration. You can really see the Morozov design, his fingerprints all over it, and it was an outgrowth. As I talked about in the T-44 video, they wanted to put a 100mm gun, although they even considered as large of a caliber as 122 on a medium tank. And just want to adjust just a little bit, maybe, says the blind guy. Trying. Anyway, they played around with the idea, the notion, and they decided, well, we really need a larger turret. Thus, we need a larger turret ring. And if we're going to do that, we really need a larger hull. And hey, while we're at it, there's a few other little changes we can make to the design and the suspension, transmission. Thus, in 1945, the project began. It's periodically referred to as Object 137, with different suffixes added as it would improve. And this would become the T-54. In the beginning, it was very much like a T-34 or T-44, including using a very similar turret. The hull was only a little bit wider and only about 16 inches, give or take, longer. But that was just enough to have a bigger ring and whatnot for the 100mm gun. And early on, it was very similar to World War II guns. It wasn't stabilized, and it had just a small counterweight towards the muzzle, not a big fume extractor as you'd expect later. And it had relatively thick armor, for example, up to 120mm in the front. Actually, later they would reduce this. So it was approved for Red Army service in 1946 and ordered into rate production in 1947, and then at a second factory in 1948. And these initial versions were known as T-54-1. But, much like with the AK Type 1, production was very slow. Part of it was just post-war. Part of it was they were having some quality control issues integrating the new technologies in what they were going with. So by the time they had many of the bugs worked out, in 1949, the T-54-2 came around. It had several product improvements, including kind of going to a new turret that was more inspired by the heavier tanks like the IS-2, IS-3s, getting away from the T-34, there we go, 34 styling. And it wouldn't be long before the Dash 3 came along in 1951. And this would have more improvements, including better sighting devices and more fuel And then in 1953, the gun itself, the D-10 gun, would get one plane stabilization, which is good. And then they would kind of change the naming convention. T-54-3, it's getting a little confusing. What is it going to be? T-54-4? Thus, they would go to T-54A around 1954. This kind of started to enter into Red Army service by 1955. But at this point, production is ramping up. And we have one major final version known as T-54B, introduced in 1957, that introduced two-level stabilization and, kind of got us into what the T-54 really would look like and away from the old World War II aesthetic of the T-44. So here we have a later T-54. Notice the fume extractor on the muzzle replacing the counterweight. And it doesn't have a machine gun on top of the turret because in the 50s the Russians decided it was kind of useless against low-flying aircraft at this time. We still do have a secondary 7.62 gun in the hull. This has a crew of 4: driver, commander, gunner, loader. The 100mm D-10 tank gun has a standard load of 34 rounds. It's manually loaded. Like I said, we have a secondary machine gun in the hull. Overall, we're at about 9 meters long, and depending on which model, around 36 tons. And not the fastest on the planet. Again, kind of depending on the model and which exact engine, around 45 kilometers per hour. But, it had pretty thick armor. Now, they would start to reduce the armor later on, going down to about 100 millimeters, kind of relying on more of the slope and changing things around a bit. Like I said, they were already updating the sighting devices, and they were adding things like smoke generators. And at this time, it's kind of verging. It's still technically a medium tank in the lineage of the T-34 and T-44. The IS-3, IS-4, and T-10 are still the big heavy hitters in the Russian military. And I've covered those in videos. But they've added fuel. We have a good reliable diesel engine. They've updated the transmission several times, leaving a lot of the old World War II problems behind. And they've started really mass producing the tar out of these. Most of the T-54s were made for the Russian military between 1953 and 1958. But of course, production would continue for some time longer. It was a dependable, solid, simple tank. Really, the downsides were it was pretty cramped and relatively primitive inside, but it got the job done and was pretty respected by the West around the time of the Korean War and shortly thereafter. And of course, as you know, it was a major export success for Russia in the 50s and 60s and 70s and even 80s. As I said at the beginning, these are still in service in many nations, of course in upgraded form today. And speaking of upgrade, well, here's our first big step forward. The T-55. One thing that's quite interesting, while its design and development started off under Morozov, he would go on to other things, and it would kind of continue with the later T-54s and T-55s at the Kirov factory, a different design bureau and factory. And work on this began around 1955, when Russia decided that it wanted to have all of its armor protected against nuclear, biological, chemical contamination warfare. You see this in all the APCs and later infantry fighting vehicles, heck, even artillery pieces. In 1956, the first kind of set of upgrades to the T-54 were unveiled. And there were a lot of different design things going on. Improved night vision, infrared, defenses, cannon rounds. Like I said, the T-54B had the two-plane stabilized 100mm gun. There was a lot of technology. There was also a lot of new production techniques kind of coming into vogue in the mid and late 50s. And this is when it transitions from being the Object 137, all the variations, into the Object 155. This kind of consolidated all these good ideas and changes, and there were various trials and updates. And then it was first put into production in 1958 in January and accepted for Red Army service later that year in May. So this is kind of why T-54 production for the Soviet Union ended in the late 50s and T-55 production picked up, because it's really the same tank, just better. They also would rework the armor to make it more practical. They would remove the machine gun in the hull to make more room inside. It was a pretty cramped interior for the crew of 4, but the extra space would end up being used for additional cannon rounds. In fact, later versions of the T-55 could carry as many as 45 rounds. So, pretty good improvement over the original. And, there'd be several other updates and changes, including upgrading the engine, things that you would suspect. So, Russia would end up with about 35,000 T-54, T-54A, and T-54Bs. And when production was finally halted at around 1980, 1981 for the T-55, they would get about 27,500 T-55s. So not quite as many, but a substantial number. And more importantly, there would be many, many, many foreign customers. And yeah. And this is another Eagle Moss Fabry model. I mean, they're cheap enough. You do get moving turret and tracks, and the hulls are metal. But let's show you a little bit nicer one. Here we have quite a nice example from Hobby Master. So you actually get a more metal gun, more detailing, but of course they do cost more. There would be a few changes and whatnot in the design during its production run for the original T-55. And yeah, it was a success. This is really what proved to the Soviet powers that be that they didn't need the heavy tank series, the IS-3, the IS-4, the T-10. This is when the medium tank became the main battle tank. It had more rounds on board, a more accurate gun, a more powerful gun, and it had respectable enough armor, good mobility, good range, and it was protected, at least nominally so, from nuclear fallout, biological chemical warfare, and other contaminants. This is really, arguably, one of the first MBTs proper. And again, it was introduced in service in early 1958. So, yeah, that's pretty good. And actually in 1968, in that time period, they would develop a new shell for the gun that would give it greater, far superior armor penetration. So about the time when they thought the T-55 and its D-10 gun was kind of getting obsolete and newer tanks were required with bigger guns, they found a way to actually squeeze more out of this gun than they thought possible. So that gave it more legs, and actually will contribute to why many countries did not go for the later T-62, and of course the T-64 Russia more or less kept for itself. So for a lot of people, the T-55 here was the ultimate Soviet tank. At least it would be for 2 decades. That's why it's so freaking daunting to try to do videos on it. But pretty historical design. But we do have one major step to go in its evolution and development. This model here is from a Mercum, so not as nice as a Hobbymaster or even an Atlas or Altea, but probably a little more detailed than the Fabry, but it's also not as durable. These tend to be pretty iffy, and it's metal, but it's very light. So in a lot of ways, I still actually like the Eagle Moss Fabry. They feel chunkier, and they're just more durable. I've had so many of the Mercums come in damaged. When you get one in that's good, it's fine, but you almost want to buy two, because it's not that they get damaged in shipping. It's just, yeah, these are basically the same price, maybe $5 more than the Eagle Moss, so cheap. But here we have a late T-55A model, and work on this really started in 1960. In 1961, the first step was to improve the nuclear, biological, chemical protection systems. Obviously, the first one was kind of Generation 1, so Generation 2. And then in 63, they would improve a few other things. They would actually stretch the hull slightly, and they would add some more fuel tankage. They would rearrange the armor yet again, and tweak the design a bit more. And it was put into production. Originally it was known as Object 155A, and it was put into production as the T-55A. Now you'll notice this one has a 12.7 millimeter machine gun on the roof of the turret. That was still not there. They still didn't have a purpose for these, although it was always kind of something optional that could be mounted. They just didn't feel it was necessary in Russia. But around 1970, minds were a-changin'. This is when attack and other helicopters started to really appear. The Huey, the Cobra. And so now there's a use again for having a machine gun on a tank, because helicopters are starting to carry tow missiles. So it's optional in the 60s, and by 1970, 72, various tanks in Russia, it starts to be a common piece of gear. They would also update the coaxial machine gun. It was still 7.62 by 54, but they went away from the SGT, the Goryanov, which was a World War II era gun, to the Kalashnikov PKT, PKMT, the modernized version, later on. So better, more reliable guns, same caliber. So they're changing the armament up a bit. This would be the kind of final major version, although there would be one more update. In 1974, the T-55A would actually get a laser rangefinder, which is kind of neat. And again, they would continue to sell and give these away to various nations. Keep in mind, at one time, Russia had taken delivery of over 60,000, just them alone, and produced 30, even as many as 40,000 for other clients in states. So it was still quite advanced for the 1970s, but by the 80s it was showing its age, with newer designs having come in like the T-62, T-64, T-72, and now the T-80. Nevertheless, when the Soviet Union broke apart in 1991, Russia herself found it still had about 3,000 T-54, T-55s in its inventory. And in 1995, when they kind of did a census of what's going on, over 400 were still in active service, plus one was used in James Bond GoldenEye, so that's cool. But these would only be in service briefly. They might have seen some use in the first Chechen War, but I'm not sure. I know by 2000 there were only fewer than 24 still in active service, with around 1,000 in the reserves. And these are very quickly sold off, scrapped, more deeply mothballed, sent to museums. because by the 2000s, we're starting to get newer tanks like the T-90, and of course they have plenty of T-80s and T-72s, so there's really no need to keep these old tanks running. But it is a tribute to them that they could keep them running. It was a very solid, dependable design with a trusty diesel engine, and it was very modular and easy to update. There were several update packages done within Russia and without. So that's why even today, dozens of nations still have some T-55s knocking about. And of course it inspired several designs in various countries, including China with their various tanks and what have yous. Again, just an overview. We could do a 3-hour video on this tank, and neither you nor I really want that. And to end, here we have them all laid out again. I really actually like this one from Fabry Eagle Moss because it's of the earliest pattern. And then I forget who made this one. This is a De Agostini or Atlas or Altea. They're all pretty exactly the same. But it's actually the heaviest of them all. Theirs tend to be very chunky. And it has the later gun, of course, but it still doesn't have the auxiliary fuel tanks on the back. A Hobbymaster is definitely our most detailed. But the Fabry version of the 55, that's what's kind of nice about them. They're inexpensive, but they don't just give them a repaint. When they do have models that are very similar, they try to do a very early and a very late, or something that distinguish them, to give you a little value for money. This one's got the fuel tank and the later style gun, a few other minor differences. And then the Americum, if nothing else, it does have the machine gun on top, which kind of adds to the series. It's probably my least favorite of these because you just don't know what you're going to get when you order them. But that's kind of implicit in the price tag, frankly. And again, I'm only talking about Russian service here. These obviously went to most every one of the Allied communist nations, Warsaw Pact, and of course the client states of the Soviet Union when they broke apart all took several T-54, T-55s. And it's interesting that kind of that division between the early work with the original T-54 and the later work with the T-54B and the T-55 sets up a rivalry that'll kind of result in our next series of tanks. But that's for next time. With that, as always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I thank you very much for watching.